the National Defense Authorization Act back in December before the Republicans could take control of Congress. It was a slick move. They should have waited till the new Congress came in, but they did it in December purposely. And what happened is it funded taking down, destroying the Confederate memorial, that huge, beautiful memorial in the Confederate part of the cemetery. It's just out of spite and meanness. So, Save Southern Heritage is an organization I've belonged to for the last couple of years in Florida. You have to pay dues. You know, Heritage Protection North Alabama is an organization we started because we get involved in politics. You know, SCB, 501c3, we can't do, you know, get involved in politics, but we can do stuff as a different organization where we don't have to get worried about the IRS coming after us. And this is another organization like that. This is a national level organization. They have backers all over the country. We had a man just give $50,000 donation to fight the monument coming down. And so we've hired a 4-name legal firm. I'm one of the 5 litigants. Teresa Roan's one of them on the lawsuit. We're suing the politically correct Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. I went to West Point with him. I marched in parades with him. He is a politician and very politically correct woke guy. We're suing General Milley, who's the chief staff or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Thank you very much. That happens often. If I get stuck like that, just hit me a couple of times like Ford assist on an M16. But anyway, I encourage you, go to their website. They've got some great stuff. You won't meet hardcore Confederates down there in Florida as these people. And they do flyovers at football stadiums with Confederate flags that drives the Yankees and liberals crazy. Everybody remember Fly Your Flag, because this is our month. I'm going to talk a little bit about Fort Pillow tonight, and this is real interest to me. How many of y'all have been to Fort Pillow? Oh good, we got some folks that actually walk the ground. Great. It's about a 5-hour drive from my home in Newmarket, minus an hour for here. It's about 4 hours, I reckon, from here. It's well worth a visit. If you take a camp trip sometime, that's the place to go. I highly recommend going in the winter. There's no skeeters, no snakes. Otherwise, it's overgrown. It's very vegetated. And the last trip I made out there, we were fighting the skeeters. I'm a military veteran. I belong to a bunch of veterans organizations. One I'm most proud of, Sons of Confederate Veterans. Got tons of veterans in my family from South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama. I'm going to ask you, please hold your questions, because I'm going to talk really fast. I'm going to flip through these slides and make your head spin. Put your seatbelts on. At the end, I'll be glad to answer your questions. I hate reading slides to you. Can you all see these in the back? Mm-hmm. If you can't see it, I'll be glad to read them. But I don't like reading slides to people. Kind of insulting, but I love these quotes. And this is descriptive of all the people who think they know about Fort Pillow, especially on the other side, that like to lecture us about Fort Pillow. So, one of the things I always talk about is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias means that everyone has biases. I have biases. I have pro-Confederate biases. Sometimes, you know, in order to get the real history, you have to put your bias aside and say, is this really true? What are the facts? And so I tell people, you know, the problem with the other side is they have confirmation biases. The guy that was in the round table that quit, he knew everything. I couldn't talk to him. You know, he wouldn't listen. He knew everything already. And he said, I know you're wrong. I said, really? So it's a logic fallacy, because what he's doing is he's taking stuff he learned and he's not opening his mind to any other possibilities. And the fact is, there's a lot of stuff we have not known for years until they've discovered diaries and other documents. There's another interpretation. I'm going to talk about another interpretation that you probably never heard anybody talk about tonight. It's not any of the books I've read, but I'm going to tell you about it. I can publish it, probably get a copyright and make no dollars on it. I wouldn't be rich and I might not be famous, but I'm going to tell you this theory I have. So, there's a link to this program. I just want to give you a little insight on this. Some of you have heard this before. I used to teach at the Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. They moved me here because they opened up a new campus over here in Redstone. And so I said, send me. They said, who wants to go to Alabama? I said, send me, it's closer to my home, my family. So the Army packed me up and moved me down here to teach. I taught there for 6 years until I got fired. And here's why. I used to set up exhibits. I got these display cases, and I used to teach a case study on the movie 12 O'Clock High. How many of y'all have ever seen the movie? Only old people remember this movie. It ought to be rated R for required. Every young person should watch it. It's a great movie. It's a World War II leadership movie. Still used by corporations and by the Air Force to teach, and the Army uses it at the Staff College. So we show the movie. Well, I put the display case together, and I put a bunch of World War II stuff in there related to the World War II movie 12 O'Clock High. I said, we'll teach a little bit about the movie and the Army Air Force in World War II. And so here's some of the stuff I put in there. I say, you know what? This is kind of cool because the general in the movie is named Savage, General Savage. It sounds like Sergeant Rock. That's a great name. It's a movie name. There was no General Savage. But he's portraying a real general that actually lived and led this bomber group in 8th Air Force in World War II. I said, this is a great tie to the Chickamauga staff ride. We used to have to take our students to Chickamauga and do a battlefield study at Chickamauga. I said, here's a great tie. One of the Cavalry Corps commanders at Chickamauga, grandson was the first general killed in World War II in action. First Army general killed in action. Anybody know who that was?
Nathan Bedford Forrest's grandson.
10 points. You can have a Coca-Cola in that break room on me. Exactly right. So I put a picture in there and a little story about the general. In his Army Air Corps uniform, he flew bombers over Germany, June of '43. He was shot down and killed, buried in Arlington. I said, this is a great tie because his grandfather led a cavalry division at Chickamauga. And we go to Chickamauga. So here's a great tie to the instruction. No sooner than I had put that display up, this guy that I worked with, former Army officer, went in and filed a formal complaint against me. My boss called me in and gave me a formal counseling and said, you're insensitive. What? For showing facts and history. So I got a formal counseling. I said, take that display down right now. So I made the display go away. I took everything down. I said, you'll never have another display put up by me. I've been doing them for 5 years and never had a complaint. So I got rid of the display, and then I got called in and told, you're fired. You don't have a job anymore. So this is the woke Army in action. My boss, who I thought was going to defend me, at first said he was going to back me up. Guess what? What was in the office next to him up at Fort Leavenworth? A print of Nathan Forrest standing over his brother's body at Okolona, where his brother was killed in action. So he's getting on to me for showing the grandson in his Army Air Force uniform, yet he has that print in the office next to him. And when I told him this, he went back and ripped it down off his wall. But I said, that's just blatant hypocrisy. You're poking me in the eye, and look what you got next to your office. But that's the Army. And so no more displays for them. I think I had an anonymous complaint on my Robert E. Lee mug, and that's when they called me in and said, you're fired. Find another job. So I left. Okay, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Let's get to Fort Pillow. How many of you have heard bad stories about Nathan Forrest and Fort Pillow? What's the most common thing you've heard? Massacre. I never use that word. I always call it the Battle of Fort Pillow, because when you use the word massacre, what you're doing is embedding that idea in other people's minds, that it was a fact, a massacre. And what I'm going to tell you is it's wrong. And that's the Yankee interpretation of it. It's a battle. So I'd like to thank a couple of good friends of mine for providing me some information. These two men know more about Nathan Forrest than they've forgotten more than I've ever known. They are just amazing. Both of them they have a number of books out. Dr. Bradley has written a ton of books. I think I have every one of them that he's written about Forrest. General Scales wrote a superlative book a couple of years ago, Campaigns, Battles of Nathan Bedford Forrest. It's great. And so if you ever want to go to the battlefields, General Scales' book's got the GPS coordinates, has the instructions, says don't drive off this bridge, it's gone. I mean, those are good instructions. So if you're out in the middle of the night and want to go park and, don't do it at that bridge. So I went over to Fort Pillow, and the Rangers over there were very helpful. And doing some genealogy since I went over there, I think we may be related. My great-grandmother came from Tennessee, Union City. I think Cole family up in that area, we're all probably related. I need to contact them. So what am I going to talk about tonight? I'm going to tell you the tactical effects of the battle, which you all probably are very familiar with, were not due to a deliberate and intentional directives and planning. In other words, Forrest didn't say this is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go in there and murder a bunch of people so it can be called a massacre. He didn't do that. It was likely a result of the terrain, the weapons capabilities, and the dynamics of combat. And I'll tell you what those are, including the passion of the participants. So I'll tell you a little bit about what that means exactly. So bottom line up front, we know for a fact there were black and white soldiers murdered after they surrendered. Fact. Confederates admit it. Some of them were shot after they surrendered. How many in here know how many were shot after they surrendered? 1, 2, 5? No one knows. And we may never know until Judgment Day. We don't know. It was wrong, but General Forrest didn't order that. We know that a number were killed during the siege and during the pursuit. And I'm going to talk more about the pursuit. And that's just because it was war. And that's what Forrest said. War means killing. It's one of my favorite quotes of Forrest. So the question remains, how many were killed legitimately and when? And so what we have to do is we can't numerically know the answer to that. There's no possible way. But what I want you to do is think about how they got killed and why the numbers might have been so high. And I'll show you the numbers at the end. Okay, here's some facts for you. Forrest never ordered any POWs ever to be killed, ever. There's no instance of that. We know that. We know that Forrest never knowingly allowed the murder of POWs. He's tried to stop it at Pillow when it happened, but he was not involved. So when they all say, well, he committed massacre, no, he did not. The war crime of killing a couple of prisoners does not make it a massacre. So congressional investigations, one right after the Battle of Pillow took place, they could not definitively say that Forrest ordered the murder of the prisoners. The Army under General Sherman conducted an investigation, and Sherman hated Forrest, and he said there's no proof that he ordered those killings. After the war was over, they had more congressional investigations. None of them could ever pin on Forrest having ordered or allowed the murder of POWs. In other words, this is all made up stuff. So, they're always quick to point how the Confederates did bad things, but they don't talk about their side because the winners write the history. How many of y'all are familiar with the Battle of Mine Creek in Kansas? Okay, Mine Creek.
My grandfather was there.
Was he?
Yeah.
What unit? You remember? He was Arkansas
He was
Cavalry.
10th Arkansas Cavalry. Under
Yes.
his brother, Colonel Allen Rufus Witt. That's where they were. Mine Creek.
That's right. Mostly Arkansas and Missouri cavalry troops. Largest cavalry battle west of the Mississippi River during the war. Unfortunately, our side lost. But what many people don't talk about is there were murders of POWs after the surrender had happened. It was brought to the attention of Union commanders by the Confederate commanders. They heard it going on the battlefield. We don't know how many exactly were murdered, but there were more than 100. 2 to 3 is what the estimate is. And to this day, they're still looking for the mass grave. I talked to a fellow on the phone about a month ago. He thinks he knows where it is. They're taking a ground penetrating radar out there to see if they can dig them up. Sand Creek, Colorado. How many of y'all know about Sand Creek, Shivington? Sand Creek, November of 1864, just a couple of months after Fort Pillow, Shivington and the 3rd Colorado Cavalry go out to a friendly Cheyenne camp. They were friends with the U.S. military. They had a U.S. flag on their flagpole, and because of their intense hatred of the Indians, they murdered not just Indian braves, but women and children. Up to 500 Cheyenne were murdered at Sand Creek and started the Cheyenne War again. And that's U.S. Army. Well, a friend of mine says, no, that was Colorado militia. I hate to tell him, they were federalized. They were wearing blue uniforms. They were working for the U.S. government. So don't try to say, oh, that's the Colorado militia. No, they're U.S. And they murdered these people. So there's a couple of things I tell people about historians. Use facts, not emotions, to judge things by. Judge dispassionately and fairly. If we make a mistake on our side, okay, we did it. We shot some Union prisoners. But we know that. It's a fact. It's established. We know because some of the Confederates even reported it. It's not by the Union side saying it. It's some of our soldiers said it. Not good, but we didn't do what they claimed we did. So this print came out in 1885. Kurtz and Allison does a lot of prints, and I've got some. My dad bought them for me when I was a first grader because I love stuff about the war, so I have a series of prints he bought me. They're all hokey. On today's standards, they're completely, totally made up. The uniforms are made up, the action's made up, the terrain's made up. And in this print here, which is famous, made it all around the United States, it shows women and children being murdered. There were no women and civilians at the fort at that time. They had been evacuated. So all this stuff gets into public mind. You see the picture, that's what people think. Oh, they were murdering women and children. No, they weren't. So the question always is it a directed and deliberate massacre? Fort Pillow is located 40 air miles from Memphis. It takes 60 miles on the roads because it's in the backwoods. You have to go look for it. It's not easy to find, but it's located right on the Mississippi River, and it's close to Memphis. But it's out in the sticks. You have to go looking for it. I'm going to quickly show you these maps. Don't get too sucked up into little lines. The red lines show that Forrest was all over West Tennessee in 1864. But what I want you to do is follow the red star. He starts in March in North Mississippi. So what you see here is northwest Alabama, northeast Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. And he begins a raid. His purpose is to get soldiers for his unit, because when he left the Army of Tennessee, after Bragg kind of shoved him out, he was told he could start his own unit, and he was a cavalry corps commander, so he went to Tennessee to get recruits and horses. And so in March, he starts north, and he's going out of North Mississippi, and he's driving north. He goes to Union City, Tennessee. On the way to Paducah, he detaches Colonel Duckworth with one of his cavalry regiments, and they capture Union City. It's a really funny story. He gets around the city of Union City, Tennessee, and he tells the Yankees, "We got you, dead to rights, surrender." And he doesn't tell him, he leads the Union commander to believe he's Forrest. And it scares the Union commander so bad, he throws his hands up and quits. No fight. They capture the Union garrison, they capture 500 soldiers, 300 horses. And then they go to rejoin Forrest, who's heading up to Paducah. They get to Paducah, they attack Fort Anderson, they're repulsed there. It's not a good attack. They capture a few prisoners and a few horses, but not very many. So Forrest says, let's head back down to central Tennessee, and they head back that way. As they go through southern Kentucky, somebody gets hold of the newspaper and is poking fun at Forrest and the Confederates. They said, those dummies, they didn't remember there's a stable or a livestock pen on the far side of town with 160 horses in it. And Forrest doesn't read newspapers, but one of his officers said, hey, boss, they're making fun of us. He gets one of his commanders, said, Chalmers, go back and get those horses. So because the newspaper pointed out that he didn't get the horses, he went back and captured them anyway. He goes to central Tennessee and he puts up his flag, sets up a headquarters in Jackson, Tennessee, and he gets a number of people starting to come in to complain to him about the Union depredations that are occurring from Fort Pillow. Fielding Hurst, Yankee commander, was a terrible fellow, was sending out men from the 6th Tennessee U.S. Cavalry, and they were stealing, pillaging, committing all sorts of atrocities against people in western Tennessee. And he went and robbed the town of Jackson, Tennessee, of $5,100. He had the civilians collect up all the money they could. Well, it turns out he had been fined $5,100 for committing a act in Memphis earlier against the citizens, so they fined him. Well, he got back and he went over to Jackson and made the people there. He said, "I'll burn your town unless you give me $5,100 by 4 o'clock this afternoon." And so they had to pay ransom for their town. You know, that's illegal. That's against the rules and laws of war. Anyway, Fielding Hurst was a bad man. He was head of the 6th Tennessee, and 2 weeks before Forrest got to Jackson, they changed command and they put another unit in Fort Pillow. They put the 13th Tennessee Cavalry, U.S., in there under the command of a fellow named Bradford. The overall command of the fort, though, belonged to a fellow named Booth. We'll talk more about him. But that's what he's doing. He's driving all over this area. Now, how many of y'all are horsemen? I know we have horsemen here. If you look at the distances, those are long, long distances. We get in our cars or trucks today and you drive that distance from North Mississippi up to Paducah. You do it in a day and you think nothing of it. But back then it was days on the road, and that's hard because horses are not machines. They need to rest, they need to eat, and when you have them on the road all the time, they have no time to really eat, and so they lose condition. So one of the reasons he went back to Jackson is to rest the cavalry horses and give them a chance to catch up. While he was there, he heard that Fielding Hurst was down at Bolivar, down here. And so he detached one of his commanders, Chalmers, and said, "Go get that guy." And they had a battle down there with Fielding Hurst. They captured 75 of his soldiers and all his wagons and his hat. He left the battlefield so fast, his hat was left on the ground. They captured his hat. He got back to Memphis, though, before Chalmers could finish him off. So all this stuff's going on. In the meantime, people are still coming to Forrest and said, "You got to do something about those fellows at Fort Pillow. They're bad people." And so he said, "I have a plan. We're going to go get them." So on the 12th of April, 1864, he marches the whole night before to get to Fort Pillow with his unit, and they surprised the Yankees. Fort Pillow is located on what used to be the Mississippi River. In 1876, the river changed direction. And same thing happened at Vicksburg, almost identical circumstances. The city of Vicksburg used to sit on the Mississippi River. Now it's just a little off the Mississippi, and there's a canal that runs north, the Yazoo Cut, that runs north. But what happened is, this dark blue here is where the river used to run. Today, it cuts short of the fort. So if you go to the fort today, you'll see water down there, but it's a slough. It's not the river, but it looks like sort of a river. It's got water in it. So what about the terrain and the effects of the terrain? Lines of drift run along ridges. The soil is called loess. It's very soft. It's a sandy soil. And if you don't have something like kudzu, which wasn't introduced until the 1920s, kudzu, to hold the soil there, it washes out and you get all sorts of ravines. And that's what kind of terrain you have there. Broken and very hilly. Compartmented means you go over all these ravines to get to where you're going if you're running with the river, because all the stuff that goes down to the river, the streams and stuff, cause cross compartmentalization, and that's very difficult to move on. So that's one of the things we look at. In the military, we look at it in terms of the military aspects. We want to look at the observation fields of fire and the maneuverability and movement. And today we're into concealment. Back then they didn't worry about it so much, but today we're worried about concealment. But those are the things that affects. So lines of drift along the ridges allow you to move easy on the tops of ridges. But the downside is, enemy can see you coming. So you don't want to get up on the ridges if you can help it. But that's where all the roads were. The crops were planted up there. heavy vegetation down in the bottomland. You don't want to go there because it's difficult to move in. The soil caused all those ravines and the washouts. It's still that way today. It's broken and hilly because of that. And if you ever go to the battlefield, I recommend in the wintertime, the leaves are off the trees, you can see much better. But as you walk the battlefield, you notice how hilly it is as you get closer to the river. And at the time of the battle, it was defoliated. Almost all the battlefields were defoliated back then. It was a wood-burning society. Everything that was along the ground, they picked up and threw it in the fireplace for heat or cooking. Wood was used to build the homes. They didn't have prefab homes. So all that wood was cleared out. And the fort used a ton of wood because it had all sorts of fortifications put up with wood walls and logs to hold the walls in place. So if you went there in 1864, it looks completely different than it does today. I got this really cool terrain map, a topographic map from General Scales. And if you read topographic maps, you can see all these little lines in there. Those are elevation lines. And the closer the lines are together, the steeper the terrain. And if you notice, right along the river here, they're almost on top of each other. And you really don't get this effect until you go there. You go, okay, yeah, that's steep. You go there and you notice it's not just steep, it's like drop-off steep. So the elevation difference between where the Confederates were outside the fort, they were looking down into it. There was a 50-foot elevation difference. That fort is really what we call the battery. That's where all the guns were that were supposed to protect the river. There's an inner works and outer works, and then the battery is just a small area, 125 yards circumference when you go there, because it's backed up against the river. They can't build on one side. So the outer works were originally built at the beginning in 1861 by the Confederates. It was abandoned in May of '62 because the Confederates needed those troops elsewhere, and so they took them away. And it was left abandoned. The Union moved in there and put in small units. It was originally designed to hold a division's worth of troops, but only about a battalion's worth or a regiment's worth ever went in there, and the Union put them in the battery positions, and that's what they defended. So if you go to Fort Pillow, you can see where the lines were. They still have some of the trench works there, but really the battle is all here in what we call the battery location. Now these photographs I took do no justice to it. I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, so you have to use your imagination. All you can see is green, right? Green and brown. Take my word for it, where that red line is, if you took a step like that, you drop 125 feet off. You could rappel down that cliff, it's so steep. It is not the one you can walk down. So how the heck did you get down this thing to the river? I'll show you in just a second. A lot of the tactics they used there had to do with the weapons ranges. So what happened was an effect of the ranges on these weapons. The artillery inside the fort and the artillery that was used by Forrest, the ranges went from about 1,000 yards to 1,800 yards, roughly, depending on the gun, the type of gun it is, and what kind of round it's firing. So if you can imagine in your mind, how far could the Federals shoot towards Forrest? How close would Forrest have to get before he could shoot them with his cannon? Rifle muskets, effective range 600 yards, maximum range 1,000. Carbines effective to 400 yards. Now, why am I showing you this? Because this battle is going to be a very close-in battle. And even though you have long-range weapons available, all this fighting is going to be close, and that's going to have an effect on what's going to be charged against Forrest after the battle's over by the Yankees. Pistols, effective range 25 yards. Close-in fighting. Sawed-off shotguns, effective range 20 yards. Now we're getting real personal. When you shoot somebody with a sawed-off shotgun, that's pretty personal. So I went there and I drove around the park and I said, how can I show people what the difference in elevation is? If you look out across to Arkansas, and the little town of Osceola is there, my great-grandfather used to live in Osceola, right across the river. You look out over this plain, you're standing on the bluffs up here in Tennessee, and you're looking over to Arkansas side, what do you see? Well, you're looking across the tops of the trees, it's all flat over there. It is totally flat on the other side. You're standing on the bluffs, and you can see these trees 150 feet tall. You're looking out over the tops of trees. This is what it looked like from the fort back then. You could see for miles. And you go, so what? Well, the so what is, you could see a steamboat, which was this is the superhighway, the interstate of 1864. You could see steamboats coming miles away because the black smoke coming up. So it was a great place for observation. You could see the enemy coming. At night, the steamboats put off sparks that come out the smokestacks. So this was a great place to see them. And it's in a bend in the river, so the ships had to slow down to go around the bend. That's why they put the cannons there. And Fort Pillow, when the Confederates designed it, was to keep the Yankees from coming down the river, and they could see them miles away. They had a battery there to protect Memphis from attack. The Yankees just took their place and moved in there. So if you go there today, the battery is here. This is where the water runs, and there's a slough that goes over here. So it's really off the river pretty far now. It's not on the Mississippi River. You have to use your imagination and just think there should be water down there. And just think that's what it would have looked like, only that water would have been right below you. Okay, this is a Google Earth picture of it. What do we see here? Green. There's not a lot of cleared out area. But if you get up close up, this is a satellite imagery of it. There's the fort right there, the battery. All these trees you see in here is reforestation. That's new forest. Ever since the war, it's just grown up. What would be really cool is if they let loggers go in there and clean it out. The problem is it would probably all wash away. So they leave the trees, but you can't get a real feel for what it looked like. That would have had no trees there. It would have been completely devoid of them. Outside the fort back then, not in existence today, there was a camp. And the Confederates originally built these cabins and buildings there. The Union came in, took them over, and that's where the troops lived. They lived outside the battery, outside the walls of the fort. That's going to cause a problem too. So when you go there, what do you see? Well, it's not a big, imposing fort, but it is pretty neat. Because they dug it out of earth, it's still there. You can walk around it, and they've done some restoration on it, and they've rebuilt the cannon and braziers and put some wood there to keep the walls from caving in. But it has 8-foot walls, and then they have a big ditch in front of it. The way they got those walls is they took the spoil, the dirt out of the ditch, and built the walls up. So it's 8 feet tall. That's hard for anybody on a horse to try to overrun. It's virtually impossible. If you're on foot, it's very difficult to do that. You'd have to have scaling ladders or some means to get over the walls, because what they did is they dug that ditch down into the ground, so it's adding another 4 feet down here, and the ditch was 12 feet wide. So that's pretty substantial. The Confederates designed it, the Yankees improved on it, and they were inside this battery fort right here. And so this is the parapet right here. Now there's a downside to this. In order to have a wide base on this thing, they kept stacking the dirt up, but on top it was 4 to 6 feet along the top. If you hide behind that wall, there's a problem. You can't see down here in what's called dead space. In order to shoot the Confederates in here, the Yankees have to crawl up on top of the wall, walk over to the edge, look down, and try to shoot. What happens then? They get picked off, because there's sharpshooters the Confederates have posted all around the fort to kill them. So this is what it looks like from General Force command position, 400 yards from the fort. You can't see anything but trees. Even in the wintertime, it's very difficult to figure out where the fort is when you're looking through here. But there is a marker where he was. And on the map, I've pointed it out. It's right outside the walls of the fort, about 400 meters away on a knoll. So there's a dip down there between him and the fort. So let's get to the battle. How many Yankees do we have there? And who are they? Well, it's under the command of Major Booth originally. He's 6th Heavy Artillery. 6th Heavy Artillery is a USCT colored troops. They're blacks. They're officered by whites, and they're enlisted black soldiers. The other unit is the 2nd D Company. They weren't batteries until later after the war. D Company, 2nd Color Light Artillery. They had a section of 2 guns. Now there's only a total of 6 guns there, but they have this unit of 304 men in the artillery that are stationed there. In order to protect them, they put a cavalry unit there. Remember, 6th Cavalry under Hurst went away. Fielding Hurst went away 2 weeks later. They replaced him with Bradford in the 13th Tennessee. What's bad about Bradford is they're called homegrown Yankees. There are Tennesseans that joined the U.S. Army, traitors. And they go to join the U.S. Army and then get stationed back in Tennessee. And what they're doing is they're abusing their fellow Tennesseans, committing war crimes against them. And a lot of the Yankees don't like to admit this. What they did, if they did to their fellow Tennesseans, if they did that today, it'd be like us going to Iraq and abusing the Iraqis. There'd be court-martials nonstop. But they didn't do that. The Union troops got away with it. They also had 2 ships available. First one was a timber-clad called the New Era. It had 6 guns on it. And then the other one was called the Olive Branch. Both of these, and this is a pre-war picture of the Olive Branch. It only had 2 12-pound howitzers on it, one fore and one aft. These were just local gun support, and they were stationed off in the river, and they are commanded by Captain Marshall, the U.S. Navy captain, and they coordinate with the commander, Booth, inside the fort in case of attack. And what they're going to do is, when they learn that Forrest is coming, they evacuate all the civilians, move them upriver to an island. So they took all the women and children away on these boats, and then they come back to provide fire support. But here's the problem. If you know anything about cannons on the decks of ships, what do they have to do if you're below these bluffs? It's like Vicksburg. You have to, where the ravines are that are on both sides of the fort. One of them is called Cold Creek. It's on the north side of the fort. That's where the Confederates are going to sneak around on the north side. They can fire down Cold Creek, but they really can't fire. The fort blocks their view of the Confederates on the other side, and on the south side, the banks are too steep. They can't elevate the guns enough. So they got a problem. They've got the guns, they can't use them. They're going to shoot a lot of ammunition, but they're not going to hit anything. Who's on the Confederate side? Well, this isn't the whole cavalry corps. Remember, Forrest has taken them and sent them off to do stuff. So he keeps about 2 brigades with him. Some of them are from the divisions. So you have Chalmers' brigade with McCulloch's brigade out of Chalmers' division. And then you have Bell from Buford's division. So he's got 2 separate division brigades of cavalry with him. And all total, all these cavalry units total, combined with Hudson's Mississippi Battery, which is a mix of 4 guns. They've got 2 12-pounders, and they've got, I believe, 2 Parrott rifles with them. They've got 4 guns, all that, 1,500 men. Well, how many are they facing on the inside of the fort? The best we can tell, there's a mix of numbers, the best number I can come up with is 593 soldiers inside the fort. So, Forrest rides the night before the battle on the 12th of April, and he hightails it over there. On the way, they run into a man who escaped from capture inside the Yankee fort. He's walking down the road, and they run into him. They say, "What's going on at Pillow?" And he says, "Here's where they are. They've got people guarding outside the fort at these places." And he says, "They're not really prepared for an attack. They don't think they're going to come." And so he's got the element of surprise, and he moves very quickly. And what happens is he sends Chalmers' division forward, or brigade forward, and they capture some of the guards that are standing on outposts. And then they immediately set up sharpshooters, and at about 6:30 in the morning, while they're eating breakfast inside the fort, they're starting to get picked off. And they go, "Something's not right here." And they know that Forrest has found them. So they raise the alarm. So the first thing that happens is sharpshooters take these posts on the knolls overlooking the fort. Remember, there's a 50-foot drop in elevation. They can look down into the fort. The fort was designed to guard the river, not to guard from land. They put the wall there just in case, but the real focus of the fort was to guard the river, not from the woods on the other side. So Forrest gets in there and he starts shooting these people, and he's not actually there. Chalmers is there, and he's got the sharpshooters picking people off. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the commander of the fort, Lionel Booth, he's a regular Army officer from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. No one really has a hard problem with this guy, Booth. He didn't do anything really bad. He's just the commander of the artillery unit. They were not the ones going out and committing the war crimes against the East Tennesseans or West Tennesseans, because they had to stay in there with their guns. The cavalry was the problem. But Booth gets a case of 58 caliber lead poisoning at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he keels over dead. So the sharpshooters got him, and what they were trying to do is shoot the key individuals. They were looking for the officers first, shoot the officers down, and that would leave the soldiers leaderless. So they killed Booth. The next guy in the command chain is Bradford, and Bradford is a bad man. He is from the same county Forrest is, Bedford County, Tennessee, but he's a Yankee. And not only is he a Yankee, he's a bad Yankee, because he's the one that's leading the cavalry on these raids to commit the crimes against the Tennesseans. This is a picture inside the battery position. They have wood walls there on the inside, but the dirt's piled up against the outside. If you go there today, it's restored. There's 6 guns to look like the guns they had there during the time of the battle. And what they had at the time of the battle, 2 6-pounder rifle guns, 2 12-pounder howitzers, and 10-pounder Parrots, 2 of those. And they had them spread out, and they had gun embrasures for them to shoot from. The cavalrymen were supposed to be in between the guns when they manned the fort, and they would shoot from between the guns. Now here's another problem. There's only one way to get out of this fort if you're trying to get away to the river, and there's a little dirt trail. That dirt trail is still there today. It's probably 1.5 people wide. You'd have a very hard time getting more than one person down that trail.
Steep.
It's very steep. And so that's hard to see. It's a dirt trail goes down. So that's a bad picture. That's about the best I can do. If you can use your mind's eye, there is a dirt trail there, and there's not much to get down. Probably looked like that back then. Forrest has some problems. And here's what his problems are when he runs up there. How do you effectively command these units? They're dispersed over about a mile of battlefield. You know, there were no radios back then, no field telephones. How do you command and control them? How do you coordinate their movements? And this is going to be a problem, because if you can't talk to them, how do you coordinate when they're going to attack and do stuff? And then how do you seize it before the Union reinforcements can come? Because they're going to send them from Memphis up the river. So here's the trail, that S-shaped, the curve-shaped line there is a trail down to the river. It goes down that steep bank through the woods and ends up down at the river. That's the only way the Union guys can escape. So when he shows up at about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, you know, the situation is they've surrounded the fort, they're shooting into it, they've already killed the commander, but they don't know they killed him. They just know they killed an officer, but they don't know it was Booth. So they start working on getting closer. They start moving units by getting in the low ground and trying to sneak up on the fort. And they do. They get around the fort, they get within just a couple hundred yards of the fort. And here's one of the things I like to talk about. Forrest was a very aggressive guy. He didn't tolerate people working for him that were not aggressive. And so when he told them, move, go attack, they did it. They jumped, because he's a big guy. And you know, he actually stabbed one of the lieutenants that tried to kill him, Lieutenant Gould, up here in Columbia, Confederate lieutenant. You all know that story? Okay. If you don't know it, it's a fascinating story. He felt bad about it afterwards, but he said, no man kills me and lives. Lieutenant Gould got mad at him and tried to kill him, and so he stabbed him and killed him, the lieutenant. He's a big guy, you know, 6 foot, 6.5 feet tall. He's a big fellow. So very imposing, but he's very aggressive. He uses what we call mission command. He doesn't tell people what to do. He says, here's what I want to have done. Go do it. He lets them figure it out, which is mission command. That's what we teach in the military today. Don't tell people how to do it. Tell them what you want done. He's decentralized. He lets the commanders go do it. He says, I'll see you at the objective at this time. And then he's initiative based. He likes commanders with initiative, especially if they're aggressive. If you're not aggressive, he'll get rid of you. The formations they used were what we call linear tactics. They attacked in line because that's the way they did things back then to control. The officers couldn't control it if they were all just running helter-skelter. However, one of the problems we run to Fort Pilot, since they got it surrounded, guess what happens when they all start moving on the fort?
Crossfire.
Crossfire. And that's one of the worst things that can happen in a unit. You have to train your unit not to kill each other. You know, you hear about these circular firing squads. It's a joke. That's literally what this is. You shoot your own people if you're not careful. Force ratio is 2.5 to 1. We outnumbered the Yankees. In doctrine today, in military doctrine today, they say the number for a successful attack, 50% chance of success, is 3 to 1 odds. Force had less than that. So how do you make that up? Well, remember, he's into bluster and threats and intimidation. That's psyops. He was using psychological operation. They were scared to death of him. Everyone was, because he had a reputation. He was a mean guy. He didn't do war crimes. He threatened to, but he never did. And so when he told them, you best surrender or I can't be responsible for what's going to happen, they were scared to death. So just after noontime, the 18th Mississippi and 20th Tennessee took the outer works. They drove the Union pickets that were in that little outer works fort. They drove them back into the fort. So now they have all the terrain controlled around the fort. And they're able to move in close. So at about 1 p.m., things are starting to slow down. Ammunition trains arrived from Jackson, Tennessee. Because he had moved so fast, his wagons couldn't go that fast, the ammunition comes, they begin dispersing it. He sends a note in to the Yankees at about 3 o'clock and he says, here's what I want you to do. He sends 3 of his officers with flag of truce to the commander. They think they're going to see Booth, but Bradford's in command now because Booth was killed. They tell him, here's what we want. And he tells them, you're going to surrender to us or I can't be responsible for what's going to happen to you. Now that's bluff. He's not going to kill them all. He's not going to murder them. That's not the way he did this. But he said, if you surrender, I'll treat you as prisoners of war. What's so different about that, even his officers kind of went, whoa, the boss is going to treat them all as prisoners? We got black soldiers in there. We're supposed to send them back to be slaves. Ford said, nope, we're going to treat them as prisoners of war if they surrender. So here's what he said. I'll read this for y'all in the back. I demand the unconditional surrender of the garrison, promising you that you shall be treated as prisoners of war. My men have received a fresh supply of ammunition, and from their present position I can easily assault and capture the fort. Should my demand be refused, I cannot be responsible for the fate of your command. That's pretty scary sounding. What's that sound like if you're a Yankee? Ooh, he's going to murder us all. Major Booth sends back a message. My name is not Hawkins. What's that mean? That means the guy that surrendered without a fight up in Union City, his name was Isaac Hawkins. And he was court-martialed by the U.S. Army because he didn't fight. He just gave up. Booth said, oh, I can take Forrest on. We can hold him off for 48 hours. That's what he told his commander earlier. We can hold the fort for 48 hours. And he sent this message back to Forrest. Forrest kind of laughed. He's probably thinking, oh yeah, I'll show you. So at about 4 o'clock, Forrest turns to his bugler, a guy named Sergeant Goss, and says, Goss, blow the charge. The charge you heard back then is not the charge you hear today. You hear da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, that's the new charge. That was 1873 regulations. And the movies get it wrong all the time. The charge back then is completely different bugle call. But Goss blows the bugle. This is their radio communication. All the buglers in the regiment start blowing the charge, and the troops jump up and start rushing. Now the Yankees got a problem because they got all these people coming at one time. They don't know who to shoot. And it's over within just a few minutes because what happens is the Confederates are on the walls of the fort and the Federals are just overwhelmed. The cannons do no good. because the Confederates know where the gun ports are. They run around them. They don't go in front of them. So they can fire all the canister they want. It's not going to hit the Confederates. And they get up on the walls. Now, I tried to do the mathematical equations, figure out how in the world do you fit 500 men in a 125-yard semicircle. I mean, they're packed like sardines. There's a good side to that and a bad side. Bad side for them is that's what you call a target-rich environment. You've just presented all these targets to the Confederates. Because if they shoot at you over here and they miss, that bullet doesn't know to stop. It just keeps going until it hits something. So my guess is a lot of those casualties on the Union side occurred during the actual breach of the walls and the charge, and they were shooting into a packed crowd of Yankees, and it caused panic. The commander says, "Men, save yourselves." And so they all start running for that path. Have you ever seen 500 men try to get down a single dirt path at one time? Just use your imagination. They were all stacked up in there. Here's the other thing. The flag had not been lowered. If you surrender back then, the thing was you had to lower your colors. The flag was still flying. What's that tell the Confederates? They are going for it. They're going for broke. They have not surrendered. They're not going to surrender. They said they weren't. So what do? You keep shooting. And this is where people today, a lot of people get really upset and they say, well, that's not fair. Duh. You know, war's not fair. How about that? So the battle began at about daybreak, went to 4:30 p.m., about 10 hours. How many soldiers could they shoot of those 593 soldiers during those 10 hours before they got into the attack and overran the fort? We don't know, and there's no Union figures. So they keep saying, well, they murdered all these people, and then they present the figures of all the Union casualties. Well, guess what? A lot of those dead were dead during the day. It's like Captain or Major Booth, who got shot in the morning. So if you start adding up all those casualties, how many do you think there are? I don't know, but I'll bet you they killed a truckload of them, and I bet you when they overran the wall, they killed a truckload of them. If they were shot prior to the assault, they were likely manning the parapet. Where do you get hit when you're standing behind a wall of dirt? Exactly right. And one of the complaints the Unions filed against Forrest is they murdered them because they were headshots. Well, guess what? If that's the only thing you can see, you shoot them there. And that's why they were shot in the head. A bunch of them got shot in the head. They said, well, some of them had powder burns. Well, duh. Remember I said about the pistols? What's the range of a pistol back then? 25 yards. They were a lot closer than that. As they came over the wall, and there's some fellow right there, he's only a yard or two away, that powder is going to get on him. So they were complaining about guys getting shot and having powder burns, but yes, that happens when you're in close combat. So those are just complaints that they're making to try to deflect on what happened. This is the real key to the whole thing. How much time do I got? Do I run out in 5 minutes?
You're fine. 15 more minutes.
15? Do we need to take a 5-minute break?
Just finish up.
Okay. So y'all cross your legs and run out. Okay, this is the key right here. I tell my military students, this is the whole point that none of the people that write the books about what happened at Fort Pillow talk about. The pursuit. All these soldiers that were in here that were going after the Yankees, remember 2.5 to 1, they outnumbered them. There's a lot of them. The Yankees were trying to get down that trail. Most of the hard fighting took place right here in the center, and we know that because of the casualty figures. I went through and looked at the rolls and how many soldiers were casualties. Highest number of casualties came out of the units right here in the center, and that makes sense. That's where the heaviest concentration of Union soldiers would have been. But this is the key point. When they pursue somebody, and this is what drives the civilians up the wall, they don't get this. An offensive operation designed to catch or cut off a hostile force attempting to escape with the aim of destroying it. That means obliterating, making sure they're dead. Destroy is not defeat. Defeat's something different. Destroy means you make them stop breathing. So when we tell units in the Army today we're going to conduct a pursuit, you know, they automatically know we're going to go kill all these guys. That's what they think, because that's what we teach them. It's not defeat them, we're going to destroy them. They cannot do anything after we finish with them. Now, let me take you back 32 years. How many of you remember the Highway of Death from the first Gulf War? You remember people in the media, whoa, it was terrible, we killed all these poor Iraqis. You know, just because they're running away doesn't mean they're not legitimate targets. Why did we kill them? Because they had not surrendered. They were fixing to go set up another defensive position and fight us again. And one of the things we teach in the military, there is no fair fight. Get them while they're running away, because they can't shoot you as well when they're running in this direction. You can shoot them in the back. I know that to some people that sounds bad. No, that's what you do. If you can shoot them in the back, that's what you want to do. That's what the alarm tells me. I got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to go fast. So, pursuit is one of the offensive forms of maneuver. It's in our manuals. It's our doctrine. We pursue the enemy until he can't shoot anymore. Retreating enemy are legitimate targets. That's international law. You can shoot the enemy when he's retreating. Unless he surrenders, he is a legitimate target. And guess what's happening at Fort Pillow? They're shooting these Yankees trying to get down that trail, and they're killing them by the bucket loads because no one took the flag down, no one put up a white flag, and no one said, we quit. In fact, on both sides, they're saying the Union troops were still firing at the Confederates from the base of the river. They'd run down there. There was ammunition put down there by Bradford because he knew something might go wrong. They'd have to go to the boats and try to get away. So he put ammunition boxes down there for the troops to get if they had to escape. And that's proof that these fellows were firing back. We know they were. Both sides admit to it. So, Forrest, being an aggressive guy, one of his favorite sayings is, keep the scare on. It's one of my favorite sayings of all time. Keep the scare on. Don't let up on the gas. Keep going after them. And he did this in numerous battles. He kept going after them. That's what his soldiers were doing. They were going after these fellows because they were legitimate targets. This, this violates some people's sensibility. If they don't understand military tactics, they go, oh, that's terrible. You can't shoot them in the back. Yes, you can. They're easier to shoot. So, in the dynamics of combat, the pursuit, keeping the pressure on so they can't stop, reform, and kill you. You don't want them to stop, get in a defensive line, and shoot you. If you go to the park today, it's a Tennessee State Park. You go down to the landing, follow that path down. There's a road down there now. They put it for cars to drive down. And I guess you can put your boat in down there. But you can actually walk down. It's not very wide. Just on the other side of this building, to the left there, 125-foot steep cliff. That's where the Yankees all ran to try to get on the boats and get away. And they were being pursued so hard, a bunch of them threw their weapons and equipment away, jumped in the Mississippi River, and drowned. How many drowned?
As many as jumped in, probably.
As many?
Yeah.
That's the best answer I've ever heard. Exactly right.
No doubt.
Lots. We don't know how many, but it's lots. They were writing about these poor deluded guys were jumping in the river. Lots. So they're killing themselves trying to get away. They were so scared. So was it a directed and deliberate massacre? What's the word massacre mean?
Mass murder.
Mass murder?
That's all I'm saying.
Okay. I buy that. It's a little more than that, but yes, I buy that.
Complete destruction of life.
Okay, complete destruction of life. Mass murder, complete destruction of life. Yeah, I love this sign. This was taken by a friend of mine in Iraq. Talking about the chicken plant where they were butchering chickens. Massacre of poultry. I guess that's what it means to them. So here's what the definition in Cambridge Dictionary. I love the British because they always have really good definitions. I use Cambridge Dictionary. It says here, killing of a large number of people, large number, who are not involved in fighting. Red flag goes up. Were the Yankees at Fort Pillow not involved in fighting?
They were involved.
They were involved.
Big time.
What else? It says they have no way of defending themselves. Did the Yankees have a way of defending themselves?
And ammunition is the river.
Absolutely. So does it meet the definition of massacre? Hardly. Now, were individuals who dropped their rifles and said, I quit, if they were shot, that's murder. That's a war crime. But it's not a massacre. Just because it's a war crime doesn't make it a massacre. A massacre can be a war crime. But think about this. A lot of those Yankees who dropped their rifles picked them up and started shooting again. That is not legal under the rules of land warfare. You have just violated the law by picking your weapon back up and shooting. That means you're eligible to be exterminated. So the highway to death, there was this American journalist. She's a Lebanese American. She's a left-wing communist. 32 years ago, she said it was a massacre. She doesn't know what she's talking about. The Iraqis were running away. They didn't surrender. This is what she just wrote 2 years ago. This is a kook. She's an American. She's a kook. She said all the Americans that did that were war criminals. Wrong answer. They're heroes. Give them a medal. Now, people say, what was so lopsided at Fort Pillow? So many more Union soldiers died. Well, again, war is not fair. Here's the totals for the first Gulf War. Look at how many Iraqis we killed. We killed them 40-to-1 ratio. Now that sounds bad, but for Army guys, that's good. 40-to-1, man, I'd join that kind of unit. On the low end, the enemy lost over 40 times the number killed in the coalition. It wasn't a massacre. They were targets. They were legitimate. And the rules of land warfare say you can shoot them. So, when did the tactical pursuit begin and the massacre or end and the massacre actually begin? That's a loaded question. There was no massacre. They were shooting legitimate targets running down to the beach. Now, we know some of the people on the beach were shot illegally. One of the Confederate soldiers, a sergeant, wrote back about some of the soldiers that had shot black prisoners. I call that, just a terrible thing. It's bad. But you know something? Based on what had been happening, you can understand the passion involved in this. You have these Confederates outside the fort all day, and when the truce is called, the black artillerymen got up on the wall and started taunting the Confederates. That was a stupid thing to do. And they, unfortunately, the Confederates fell for it. So, this is what General McPeak, the U.S. Air Force, said after the Gulf War. He said, when an enemy army is defeated, they retreat. It's during this phase the true fruits of victory are achieved from combat when the enemy is disorganized. In other words, that's when you get them, because they're not shooting you, they're running away. Casualty rate, out of the 593 in the garrison, 226 marched off. That's important. If it was a massacre, they could have killed them all. They didn't. They took prisoners. 52% killed in action on the enemy side. Now this is where people go, well, the figures are way too high. Really? How do you know? 10 hours of combat, they're shooting them down inside the fort, and then they break in and chase them in the pursuit and are shooting them down. How many were killed in legitimate combat? We don't know. There were a handful killed, murdered, but we don't know how many. But to say that Forrest ordered a massacre is just dead wrong. It violates all the facts. The press jumped on this with both shoes, and one of the news correspondents in Washington, D.C. had never even been to Fort Pillow. He's writing in first person how all these poor black soldiers had been murdered. And he knew it. He wasn't even there. And so a lot of these black soldiers were coached in the hearings they had, the congressional hearings. If you read the reports, somebody with an English PhD wrote it. You can tell it's not some private soldier talking. So, were there individual war crimes? Yes. We don't know how many. There were several. We know that. But there was no massacre. And when people call it the Fort Pillow Massacre, dead wrong. This is what Edwin Bars said. How many of you remember Ed Bars? Real famous historian, worked for the National Park Service for years. their chief historian. Now, he's a Yankee, but here's what he said. If force had intended a massacre, there would have been few, if any, survivors. Over half the garrison walks away after the battle. So, my conclusion, there was no massacre. What happened was the effect of a number of different things, but it wasn't a planned massacre. William Sherman compliments Forrest. He didn't like him during the war, but after the war was over, he said he's probably one of the most remarkable men the war produced. He really respected him because he knew how Forrest operated, really. And how many of y'all know Gerald Moore over in our camp? Gerald went with me up there 10 years ago. Gerald's not doing well. If you don't know, he's got cancer real bad, and he's not doing well at all. But he was able to hang with me that day, and we marched up and down a bunch of ravines. So that's it. Any questions, unfortunately?
Good thing now, good thing you missed it.
Yeah, I heard.
That was terrible.
Yeah, I heard. Black Lives Matter get together.
Yeah, they were all there, yeah. I went with Buzz Estes and I didn't think we'd ever get back. I thought he'd wreck before we ever got back.
Yeah, it's I heard about it. Yes, sir.
Terrible.
One thing, we've now had the movie Hacksaw Ridge, which shows the Japanese surrendering, then throwing a hand grenade and such, which from the research and reading and being at Fort Pillow, there had been some surrendering, but then there was a rifle firing from the group. And again, like you alluded to, if one of them fires, they're all targets.
Fire. That's right.
They're all targets.
Yes, exactly.
So, my thing would be, if you bring that up, that might describe to people today what it means to have a group that surrendered and someone in there starts the attack again.
Absolutely right. Totally agree. And that's probably what happened.
And
All it would
therefore,
take is one in a group to do it. They're all guilty.
therefore, other than the individuals that may have been murdered, you started off saying, I would much prefer you say killed.
Yes.
But Yankees wrote history.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. You're exactly right. One fellow in the group fires are all guilty as far as I'm concerned. And that happened on both sides of the Pacific. The Germans, they had instances of German carrying a hand grenade and throwing it, and then they all get killed because one guy threw the grenade, but you don't know who that guilty guy is. Let God sort him out. Yes, sir.
Another program I saw on this talked heavily about a lot of alcohol being involved inside the fort. Is there any truth to that, or
Yes.
is there any proof of that?
Yes. The settlers had brought alcohol to the post. It was not provided by the army, but they broke out a barrel of whiskey and dippers and allowed the soldiers in the defensive positions along the wall to help themselves. And Bradford's thought was that'll help steel their nerves to make them more brave. And what it did do is made a bunch of drunk soldiers. And they ran away just as fast. But now they're drunk. So, yeah, they did have whiskey. In fact, that was spoken about by several different people. One of the Confederate commanders wrote that in his after-action report. He said not only were they scared, they were drunk and disorganized. And the problem is, once the leaders were shot down, there was no one to organize them. So those guys that picked up the muskets and shot again at the base of the cliff, no one said stop shooting, surrender. They just do whatever came as impulse. One more question, I'll call it
Anybody
quits.
else?
Nope. Okay, thank you all very much for your
Yeah,
attention.